We're moving on to our next session. I'll introduce our next speaker. Henry Sue is a professor of economics in Vancouver School of Economics. He's going to be presenting his paper on A Tale of Two Workers, the Macroeconomics of Automation. And then we're going to hear from his discussant, Gabriel, how do I say the surname? Mathy. Okay. Gabriel Mathy, who is assistant professor of economics at AU. So we're going to hear first from Henry and then from Gabriel.
Fantastic. All right, good morning. Thanks so much for having me. Thank you to Gabriel for serving as discussant. This is very much work in progress that my co-authors and I are working on. We're just waiting for the slides to come up. But this is joint work with Nir Haimovich, Itai Sporta-Eckstein, and Yaniv Yedid-Levy. I'm going to tell you now about some work that we've been working on in terms of explicitly thinking about policy proposals and policy experiments that we think might be more or less useful in aiding those who have been most negatively affected by automation in the US. So as a large literature has demonstrated, there's been a profound change in the nature of work, the types of jobs that are performed in advanced economies like the US and across essentially all industrialized countries. The primary factor behind this change in the nature of work, not the only factor, but the primary factor is advances in automation technology. And what you see in the US is that there's been a sharp fall in the fraction of the population that's employed in what we refer to in economics as a routine occupation. So this idea of routine comes from thinking about all jobs as being able to, you being able to describe them along two dimensions: routine work versus non-routine work. Routine work is work that focuses on a narrow set of tasks that can be performed if you follow a well-prescribed set of instructions. So there's routine, non-routine. There's manual versus cognitive. Essentially, manual would be the brawn jobs. Cognitive would be the brain jobs. So you can split all jobs roughly into one of these four quadrants. Okay, so there's been a sharp drop in the fall in the fraction of people employed in routine jobs, both routine manual and routine cognitive. And today, I think the punchline of what we've done is we've put together a macroeconomic model to evaluate policy proposals. The punchline, if you want to take a nap, go ahead. I'll just give you the punchline now. All the proposals we consider, things that we've heard people talking about, some are better and others are worse. So promising proposals that we find within the context of our model is a reform to the UI system, making unemployment insurance benefits more generous, labor income tax reform in terms of magnifying progressivity, large-scale retraining programs. There's an asterisk there. I'll tell you why there's an asterisk there when we get there. There are also some pretty terrible policy ideas within the context of our model, UBI, not a great thing. Okay, so this is obviously a relevant topic, a relevant search topic nowadays. So if you just type in will space R, apparently this is what Google will propose to you. I have to admit, I had to get one of my co-authors to do this because I'm from Vancouver, as Richard said. You call that the Pacific Northwest. In Canada, we call that the West Coast because we have no Northwest. So it's the West Coast or the Wet Coast. So if you type WIL space R, what you get is, will rain in Vancouver when I tried to do this? So anyways, okay. So again, disappearing job opportunities in routine. These are routine manual jobs. The classic is the machine worker, middle-class job, already been in decline. According to the BLS, predicted decline even more in the future. Here's a routine cognitive job. Classic example is a secretary, already been in decline. Middle-class job, predicted decline even more. Here's just a picture, of all the work being done in the U.S. economy from the 1980s to today, lumping the routine manual and routine cognitive jobs in the middle. They've been in decline. High-paying non-routine cognitive jobs, like policymakers, managers, CEOs, software engineers, economists, growing. Non-routine manual, caretakers, groundskeepers, personal care aides, home health aides, also, especially recently, growing. Okay, So there's two parts to the paper, 35 minutes, I can't talk about both, but there's an empirical part which informs our model construction, okay? And so I'm not going to talk to you about this, in detail, but essentially the idea is, in the 1980s, you could identify someone who was working in a routine job, okay? They had specific characteristics. The question is that we need to address is, if you were somehow able to cryogenically freeze that person and teleport them into today, a lot has changed in the past 40 years. One of the major things is automation. You plop that person down into today, unfreeze them, that person might be able to find work in a routine job, but likely they're not going to be able to find work in a routine job. So the question is, what are those people doing instead? And so that's the kind of thought counterfactual we need to address to be able to make our model analysis relevant. So we developed some new approaches to doing that. One is matching people on AFQT scores in the NLSY, 1979 versus 1997. Another is to, essentially, our co-authors, we're automating our own work rather than actually, looking at all those individual level characteristics and trying to, sort people here and there. We're just asking the computer to do it. So that's the new thing. But the punchline is as follows. So if you are somebody who is likely to be a routine worker, you've seen a large fall in the chances that you're doing that kind of work now. So what are they doing instead? As already been discussed by Jim, it's not that these people are more likely to be unemployed nowadays, okay? And it's equally not likely that they've somehow become a software engineer, okay? What's taken up the slack? Of the slack that needs to be taken up, a smaller fraction, a third of it, has been taken up by movements into non-routine manual work, so low-wage work. Much more of it in the US is that they are out of the labor force. They're much more likely to be a non-participant in the labor force, okay? And this is what's driving the fall in the US working age, prime age labor force participation rate. It's this, okay? So this serves as guidance into what we think of as an empirically relevant macroeconomic model that we think is fit for policy analysis. It's a general equilibrium model, so rather than a partial equilibrium model, a simple elaboration of an Econ 100 labor supply, labor demand model. We're going to be thinking about equilibrium in the whole economy, so we're going to be thinking about job creation, people making participation and occupational choices in conjunction with other people making investment choices to balance off the whole macroeconomy. There's going to be a heterogeneous agent model, so we're going to explicitly think about, the entire income distribution and how automation affects people in different parts of that income distribution. Automation, obviously, is reflected as an aggregate in the large improvement in welfare, but this masks winners and losers. We're trying to identify who those people are, and we're going to use this model as a lab. The two types of programs that we're thinking about is a retraining program and other redistributive programs. Okay, so I hope I've adapted this presentation sufficiently from an hour and a half down to a 35-minute talk. So here's the basics. We're going to think about two broad classes of workers. They're going to be, the high-skill workers. In economics, we use the word skill and wages synonymously. So they're going to be the high-wage workers. These are the relatively boring people in the model. They're all going to be identical. They only work in the high-paying, non-routine cognitive jobs. Like in the data, these people face very little unemployment, so there's going to be no unemployment among these people in the model. But they do choose how much to work, and we're going to be taxing them. And so, the more you tax them, the less they're going to want to work, okay? All the action happens among the other people. Well, what's the opposite of high? It's low. I'm not saying that these are all low-skilled people. These are going to be the middle class and low-wage workers in our economy. They're going to be heterogeneous, and they're going to be endowed with a workability, a skill in the two occupations that they work in, routine jobs and non-routine manual jobs, okay? And that skill distribution is going to be summarized by gamma. And these people are going to be making the important choices. They're going to choose whether they want to participate in the labor market or whether they want to sit out. And if they decide to participate, they might be unemployed, but they might be working, and they need to choose whether I want to look for a routine job or whether I want to look for a non-routine manual job. They're also taxed on labor income, but at a lower rate. The key thing is that there's also going to be this automation capital. Automation capital, you can think about it as personal computers or robotics. Automation capital substitutes for work done in routine occupations. Firms are going to be making investment decisions on how much automation to adopt. We've got a tax system that features capital income and profit taxation. Who's going to own these firms and capital? Like in the data, we're going to give them all to the high skill. They're going to be the capitalists. We do that for analytical tractability reasons, but it's a pretty good approximation to the way the real world looks. Okay, so yeah, automation is going to directly benefit the high skilled. This is the only equation I'm going to show you. Maybe I shouldn't even show you. But again, yeah, automation capital, that X, it substitutes for routine work. So if you want to build a car, you either, hire a bunch of, metalsmiths, engine builders, welders, or you just buy a robot to do it, okay? So you're going to produce a bunch of cars there. You can build the cars, but you got to sell them. You're also going to need high-skilled people to get that out the door. You're going to need market analysts, market researchers. You're going to need managers. You're going to need financial specialists. So the more cars you have to sell, the better it is for the high-skilled individuals. The high-skilled individuals are the red. Low-skilled people, they either choose to work in the routine occupation or in the non-routine manual occupation. And those job openings are going to be created by firms in the standard search and matching literature. We're just going to adopt that. And there's going to be unemployment amongst these people. Yeah. Okay, one of the key things about the search and matching literature that we think is relevant is the idea that the wages that are going to be negotiated for these low-skilled people, they're going to depend on a bunch of things. It's going to depend on bargaining between the firm and the worker. The key thing here to be useful later on is that one of the key ingredients to a low-skill individual's wage is their outside option of working for that firm. Okay, the government is going to balance a budget. What are the revenues? It's going to be all the income taxes and capital and profit taxes we talked about. What are they going to spend on? They're going to spend on unemployment insurance benefits, and they're going to spend on transfers to people who don't earn an income, transfers to people outside the labor force. And this all comes together in a macroeconomic model. Okay, so the way to picture this is to think about this is the skills of the low-skilled, so they have an ability in the routine work, in the routine job. They have an ability in the manual job. So I would be somebody down here. I'm not very skilled. I'm close to 0-0. You folks are people over on the other end. You're really good at both things, okay? But there's all kinds of people. There could be people who are bad at manual work but really good at routine work, or they could be really bad at routine work, really good at manual work. Those isobars kind of are trying to represent that if you were to project this into a third dimension, that's where the probability weight is. That's the distribution, okay? And in an occupational choice model, you're going to get a dotted line. Everybody who sits on the dotted line, those are the people who are equally happy, given their payoffs of working in the routine job or the manual job, okay? But if you're to the right, you're going to say, oh, it's better for me to work in the routine job. People to the left and to the up, they're going to be better off working in the manual job, okay? Again, like I said, we're going to add into this standard occupational choice framework the idea that, no, if you don't want to work, you're going to get a transfer that's independent of your ability. And so what that means is that there's going to be this yellow box where everybody below this cutoff and that cutoff, they're going to say, you know what? I'm better off being outside the labor force, okay? So that's graphically what our model looks like. Again, because this is a macroeconomic model with a lot of bells and whistles, that diagonal line is in general not going to be a straight line, but we're going to build back into the model assumptions that make it straight, okay? All right, so now I want to consider, well, what happens when there's automation? So what automation does is it reduces the relative value of working in a routine job. So how do you represent that in this picture? Well, what happens is that diagonal line, the slope changes. So if I flip back and forth, you can see that with automation, the slope falls, the area in red, it shrinks, okay? And where are those people going to move to? They're going to move to either manual work or they're going to leave the labor force. And so the key thing we need to do in our model is discipline all the parameter values such that, like I said, of the people who left routine manual work, a third of them went to the blue, but 2/3 of them went to the yellow. So that's going to be the key thing that we want to discipline the model with. And so, yeah, once we get to the policy analysis, what policy analysis is doing is it's essentially either changing the slope of that diagonal line. Automation is going to drive it down. Certain policies can drive that slope back up. Other policies will say, well, that straight diagonal line, it's not going to be a straight diagonal line anymore. You're going to reintroduce the wiggles to it. And a retraining policy says, well, this was the original probability weight map. Maybe retraining can shift that weight away from, these low-skilled people being particularly good at routine work. Maybe we can make them particularly good at manual work. Okay? So that's graphically the nature of the policy proposals that we think about. I'm not going to talk about this. I'm just going to say that how do we, we're macroeconomists are economists that really love numbers. We need to find a way to discipline how much automation has been experienced in the economy, and we're going to use the relative price of ICT capital as our measure. Our model, like many models, the relative price tells us about advances in automation, the productivity of that type of capital. And again, like I said, we want to set the model parameters so that we get this 2/3, 1/3 split. If I'm not going to be working routine, with 2/3 probability, I'm going to leave the labor force. With 1/3 probability, I'm going to stay in the labor force but work in the other job. This is important from an academic perspective. We don't target the fall in the amount of routine work, so we have some testable, untargeted implications of the model that we can say, oh, this is a pretty good model. One of the things I will just say quickly is there's been this large literature on the fact that, of all of national income in the US, and this is true in other economies as well, you can broadly split national income into labor's share of income and capital's share of income. So capital would be profits, dividends, capital gains, okay? And what's true in an economy like the US is that labor's share of the pie has been shrinking. What's also true is that it's not all labor's share has been shrinking. It's been shrinking for the routine, for the middle class. And our model delivers that, okay, broadly speaking. Okay, so to the welfare results. So again, automation is reducing the slope of this diagonal line. And so what you can see is, some people stay, who were routine, stay routine. Others leave the labor force. Others go into the other occupation. But again, what also happens is when you get automation, it also draws a bunch of people who were out of the labor force into the labor force, but into the low-paying job, okay? And so what does our model say about, if I feed in the amount of automation that I've seen over the past 30 years, 30, 40 years, what does that do in terms of welfare? Well, you can see here in the top box, who loses? It's the people who used to be in routine work, okay? They're the losers from automation. Who are the winners? Not surprisingly, the high-skilled. They really win. But they're a small fraction of the population. The losers are the previously middle-class routine workers. Okay, so let me talk quickly now about some policy experiments. So like I said, we have two broad classes of policy experiments. One is a retraining program. And the idea is that we're going to think about targeting the people who are negatively affected, these low-skilled individuals who have left the labor force. And we're going to train them to become manual workers, okay? So, I don't want you to think about this training program as taking these people and suddenly, sending them to a 4-year college and making them computer science majors and getting them a software engineering job. Or I'm not talking about, turning these people into physicians or surgeons. again, we're training them to do non-routine manual work. So, I think that this comes, it kind of addressed the question as to, why is it that, there are some Americans who, for whatever reason, they're sitting out of the labor force when there are job opportunities available to them in, what we think of as the caring economy. What are the big growth occupations in the U.S.? Home health aides, personal care aides, child care, preschool type education. This is work that is in high demand. It doesn't require a four-year college degree. How do we nudge Americans into this type of work? The other programs are going to be explicitly redistributive. I'll talk about that later. But it's going to be transferring resources from the high-skilled to the low-skilled. So we're going to retrain those who nowadays, in our post-automation equilibrium, we're going to train the labor force non-participants by offering them, hey, I have a magic pill you can swallow that will just automatically bump up your ability in the manual job by some increment, okay? I'm not, this is a model. I'm not going to be specific about how you do it, but magically take this pill. You're going to be better at manual work, okay? Some people, their manual ability is so low that, I take this pill, I'm still going to be out of the labor force. I'm going to say, I don't want that training program. I'm just going to stay where I am. But others, their ability, it was pretty high, and this is going to put them over the bar. I'm going to say, yes, I'm going to select into that treatment. I select into that training program. I get trained. I become a labor force participant with the eye towards doing manual work, okay? So what we do in our model, in our analysis, is we find that the size of that magic pill to bring labor force participation back to the pre-automation level, okay? So we're trying to get, the prime working age labor force participation rate back, particularly amongst these individuals. So, this is just to indicate, look at the top line, automation caused labor force non-participation to rise. We're going to bring non-participation back down to its old levels through this retraining program. Who benefits? Not surprisingly, it's going to be the people who are out of the labor force who went into the manual occupation. This is really good for them, okay? But this sort of retraining program, that's what this general equilibrium analysis sheds light on, is it's not a win for everybody. Who is it a loss for? It's going to be a loss for the people who otherwise were there, but now there's this flood of people who are originally out of the labor force into my occupation. My skill at this job is now less scarce. It's the classic supply effect. The supply effect, drives down the return to being who I am. And what happens is that a bunch of these people, they might stay in that job. They lose out by 3.2%. Some of them get driven into the routine job because, there's too many people. This occupation is overcrowded. Some of them leave, okay? Surprisingly, amongst the high skilled, they actually benefit from this kind of retraining program, okay? Now, this is a large-scale retraining program to bring the labor force participation rate back. You need to essentially treat 3% of the working age population. So this is big. How much would that cost? We're macroeconomists. We're not education economists, so I don't know how to rig up a production function for manual skills. So we're just going to back of the envelope calculator. Okay. So what happens is that because of this retraining program, you bring all these workers back into the labor force, GDP actually rises by about 1%. Okay. So this 1 divided by 3, that means that if the per participant cost of this retraining program were less than a third of per capita GDP is big, so a third of it is big. So, if everybody who selects into this retraining program were pretty darn costly, it would still be a net benefit to the economy. Okay? So that's the sense in which I'm saying these kinds of retraining programs, they look promising, because they can be pretty costly and they're still, to the economy as a whole, a net beneficial thing. The open question is, do programs like this actually exist? That's what I leave as a question to the floor. 10 minutes. So in terms of the redistribution policies that we study, we're going to study 4 so far. This is, again, work in progress. We've studied 4 so far. One is a increase in the generosity of UI benefits, unemployment insurance. One that people like to talk about is the introduction of a universal basic income. Everybody just gets a pot of money to spend, regardless if you're high-skilled, low-skilled, unemployed, out of the labor force. We can explicitly transfer income to people who are out of the labor force, or we can, make the labor income tax schedule more progressive. Again, all of these programs, we're going to be thinking about financing them through increased taxation of the high-skilled. Okay, and to make all the experiments comparable, we're going to think about, in all of these experiments, its dollar value equivalent is about $500 per month. Okay, so if we're thinking about the increasing the generosity of unemployment insurance, we're going to say unemployment insurance benefits are going to be more generous by an amount of $500 per month, approximately $6,000 a year. Okay. I don't know if I have time to go through all of them, so by show of hands, who would like to see the UI benefit increase experiment? Who would like to see the UBI? Okay, more people would like to see the UBI. The labor tax reform I'm going to do because it's a nice counterpoint to the others. Okay, so the UI benefits, I'll tell you just very briefly, it's a winner. Everybody benefits if you make unemployment insurance more generous. I could talk about that in the 50 minutes afterwards, okay? The only thing is that the gains are small at the level that is required to bring labor force participation back to what it used to be. The welfare gains are small, but what's true is it's, at least within the context of our model, politically palatable, okay? Because everybody benefits. UBI, and this is the same mechanism as the increasing transfers to those who are out of the labor force. UBI is, at least, again, within the context of our model, it's terrible, okay? It's great for some, it's terrible along many dimensions. Because what UBI does is it says, look, no matter what you do, you don't have to be working. You could be unemployed, you can be out of the labor force. You're going to get $6,000 a year. So proportionate to what you're earning, that's really great for the non-participants relative, for instance, to the high-skilled. So it really incentivizes non-participation. So you can see that, the move from the pre-automation to the post-automation world, that increased non-participation by a factor of 2. UBI increases it by a factor of 6. So you get a mass flood out of the labor force with UBI. All these people are leaving, and it's really costly. GDP falls. So whereas automation caused GDP to rise by about 12%, essentially you're killing all those benefits by introducing the UBI. And again, how are we financing this UBI? We're taxing the high-skilled. The high-skilled labor tax rate has to increase massively to fund this thing. Okay, so that really disincentivizes work, not only amongst the low-skilled, but also amongst the high-skilled. So who loves it? Who loves it? Non-participants love it. If you're already non-participating and suddenly you get a UBI, you're 34% better. And it also causes a whole bunch of people who were working in low-wage and middle-wage jobs to switch into non-participation. Who hates it? Obviously, the high-skilled, they hate it, okay? 6 minutes left. Is there a better way to redistribute, the aggregate economic pie? We're going to consider a labor income tax reform where we're going to increase the progressivity of labor income taxes, okay? What we're going to do is we're going to decrease the average income tax paid by low-skilled workers. These are the middle-class routine workers and the low-wage manual workers. We're going to decrease their income taxes on average by, again, that same number, that $500 per month. And in the model, this essentially means set their income taxes to zero. Okay? So the government revenue is going to fall because you're not taxing the middle and low class anymore. You need to balance budgets, so you've got to increase taxes on the high skill. Again, what you can see is, whereas UBI caused non-participation to rise, making taxes more progressive causes participation, non-participation to fall. In other words, it increases participation. Why? Because I was originally a non-participant. Part of the reason was because part of my income is going to get taxed. Now you're not taxing me anymore. That increases the return to looking for work, so I enter the labor force. Okay? So you get this rise in the amount of work being done in the routine and the manual occupation. But again, you're taxing the high-skilled more heavily. That disincentivizes them from working. So their labor, the amount of work that they do, that -2, that's a negative. But the fact that more routine and manual work is getting done means that on net, there's a very small effect to aggregate GDP. Okay? And relative to UBI, it's a smaller increase in high-skilled taxes, okay, because it's a less costly program. And so what you get is that, this tax experiment where we make taxes more progressive is pretty effective at redistributing income towards the middle and low class. Again, for obvious reasons, the high skilled are worse off, but they're not that much worse off, at least relative to something like a UBI program. So it's not too costly to the high skilled, so perhaps this is politically palatable. Whether that statement must be qualified by time and place, obviously. Okay, so again, what we're working on, is a framework, an empirically relevant macroeconomic model of automation that, emphasizes the fact that automation has winners and losers. The reason we're doing this, we think of it as a useful laboratory that we can evaluate various policy proposals that are being discussed. Some are better than others. Again, we think this is useful for what people are talking about now and what people should be talking about in the future as automation progresses. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thanks, Henry. Gabe?
Lapel's better, okay. Okay, thank you. All right, thanks very much. Thank you, Henry. Hope you'll excuse my voice. I'm a little under the weather, but I really wanted to be here today with you all. So this is a really great paper. I hope everyone gets a chance to read it. These authors are really leaders in this field. There's nobody else probably on planet Earth that's better to write this paper, and labor search and matching framework is really the right way to go. It allows them both to look at the consequences of automation as well as this kind of rich set of policies that they can really dig deeply into this. So, a lot of macro papers, the kind of policy experiments are not always very credible. That's really not the case here. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the kind of modeling aspects of the paper, and then I'll move on to kind of big picture questions, and I'll suggest some more work for the authors, some new policies they could look at. In terms of the UBI, they find that it's pretty bad. There's been some empirical work on the subject. So if you look at Jones and Marinescu, they look at a UBI-like program in Alaska, and so they find kind of offsetting effects so that the net effect is zero. So they do find this kind of negative labor supply effect that when people have UBI, they are able to work less, and they do find an increase in part-time employment rather than full-time. But overall, the net effect on employment is zero. And we don't know if the part-time employment is people playing video games, or if it's mothers taking time to spend with their children, or people taking time to go to school. But overall, essentially, there's two factors, and one is modeled in the paper and one is not. One is the negative labor supply effect, but there's also liquidity-constrained households, and so they're going to spend more when they get this UBI, and so they find a kind of offsetting effect where the tradable industries, where demand is not going to be local necessarily, are going to see a big decline in employment, but you're going to see a relatively stable employment level in the non-tradable industries where demand is going to be locally based. So the authors might think about looking at kind of hand-to-mouth consumers to try and think about this effect. So also in terms of taxes, they use a fairly standard framework. So this is not specific to their paper, but in general, in macro papers, you're going to find that in general, when taxes go up, net wages go down, and so then labor supply is going to fall. So that's essentially a kind of substitution effect that you get that the value of leisure stays the same while the value of work falls. But a fairly standard kind of micro econ 101 effect is that you have an income effect too. And so in general, if you look at societies across time, as they get richer, as wages rise, they actually tend to work less because you have an income effect. So people buy both more consumption goods and more leisure. We've talked about Keynes. So obviously, it wasn't right about how far hours would fall, but over time, as societies get richer, they tend to actually work less. If you look at richer versus lower income countries, the higher income ones work less. So the Germans work less than the Greeks because Germany has a higher average income per capita. And then as countries grow over time, they tend to work less. So this is not specific to this paper at all. This is across kind of all the macro literature, back to papers by Prescott and others. But it's kind of strange that we haven't yet really modeled this very simple kind of result. So if you look here over time in the upper left, we have the US, and you see hours falling over time. And then here's a sample of some OECD countries. So, Japan, as they've gotten a higher income, they actually work fewer hours than Americans now. And the bottom line here is the Germans. So you might think of France as having low working hours, but actually now Germany has lower working hours. And so I'll talk more about Germany in a second. So in terms of automation, there's this framework in Acemoglu and Restrepo. So they've got to confuse us. There's AR, Acemoglu and Robinson. This is the other AR. So this is a framework to think about automation, and so they think about two kind of effects. There's a displacement effect, that the workers directly affected by automation are going to be worse off, and that's kind of the main channel this paper looks at. There's also a productivity effect, because automation is going to increase productivity. It raises demand for all products, and so it's going to raise demand for all the other tasks that are not automated. And so it's going to be a kind of race between these two effects. So for automation to be a really big problem, we need that the displacement effect is going to outweigh the productivity effect. And so, in terms of the current situation, obviously there's some affected workers. In terms of the aggregate, is automation going too fast? Are we seeing some kind of robo-apocalypse, as we heard earlier? In the aggregate, we actually have somewhat slower productivity growth, and we have kind of record high employment, so it doesn't seem to be a kind of mass problem, but we still can have some problems with specific aspects. And one might be inequality. So the paper doesn't focus specifically all that much on inequality, but implicitly you've got kind of middle skill workers, kind of middle class workers that are being pushed into being low skill and low wage. And so then that could increase inequality potentially. And so, the authors only have data for a few decades. And it's true that over this time, inequality has risen, but, as an economic historian, this is a fairly small slice of, human history. And so if you look, you have different authors that find different increases in inequality. Obviously, Piketty is going to find a much larger increase. Auden and Splinter find a smaller one, but overall, we know the general trend since about 1980 that you've had increasing inequality. So if you look at the period since 1980 and you think about automation, then it looks like, those two things are linked up. But if we take a longer span of history, we'd want to think about periods when inequality is falling. Are those periods with slower automation? And so some of the terminology in the paper is, I find a bit strange because they talk about a pre-automation period. But obviously, we've had automation in things like cotton textiles for a quarter of a millennia at this point. And so you have, from the beginning, some middle-skill workers. These are the Luddites, famous Luddites, who were kind of middle-skill craftsmen, who were weavers, and their jobs were being automated away in the early 19th century, and so they raged against the machine and tried to break these machines because their jobs were being replaced by low-skill textile workers in the Industrial Revolution. And so what's the case here? Were they irrational? If we look on the right, you can see Greg Clark's numbers on the ratio of craftsmen to kind of low-skilled wages, and it's true that these people got automated away, and the craftsman skill premium relative to low-skilled workers is going to collapse over the 19th century. So they're going to lose out. But overall, it takes some time. If you see on the left, you can see when Engels is writing about the dire conditions in British factories. But eventually, this kind of productivity effect is going to cause gains in wages, and all this demand for low-skilled labor is going to raise living standards. It's the story of modern economic growth and the prosperity that we see today. So, what's going to happen to inequality over this period? Here we can see from Lindard and Williamson. You can focus on the UK, earlier England and Wales. So when the Luddites are destroying the machines, there's actually going to be a period when inequality is declining. So it's not inevitable that automation will cause inequality. It's going to depend on how institutions are set up and this productivity versus this displacement effect. As they're seeing their kind of middle-class jobs being destroyed, it's creating a huge amount of demand for low-skilled labor, which is going to raise living standards and actually see a decline in inequality from about 1800. The Luddites are about a decade after that. The UK inequality is going to fall for almost 2 centuries after that. So we periodically have these kind of panics about automation. I guess this conference is part of that. But you see it in the Great Depression, too. There's panics about automation causing the unemployment in the Great Depression. And so then, the idea then was that you have industrial skills and all the farmers just can't hack it with these new skills and industries. And so then once the economy recovers, you get kind of infinite demand during the war, then everybody kind of forgets about this automation fear once unemployment ends. So another kind of thing to think about is that being routine is not going to be inevitable. So something like an accountant would have been unimaginable to be routinized. Now it's always kind of a front runner for being routinized away. But to some extent we have the institutional framework to think about too. In the U.S., the tax preparation companies have blocked the government from automatically filling your tax forms. And so unlike the Luddites who eventually would lose, the tax preparation companies have been successful at blocking automation. And so the institutional framework is going to matter for how institution matters for economic outcomes. So in terms of alternative policies, I think the UBI comparison is nice. It's kind of topical for thinking about automation. But I think we should consider some other policies. We've got the real wage that's related to productivity, but it's really going to be mediated through these labor market institutions. And so I'd like to consider a case of another country that I think has been more successful with automation, dealing with the kind of social consequences of that. So when we think about Germany, they've got these co-determination institutions that are going to give workers a lot more power to determine how the labor markets function, what's going to happen to jobs when jobs are automated away, and how wages are set within a large firm. So we've got things like work councils that are going to have workers advising firms, and then co-determination where workers are going to sit on the boards of large firms. So it's been successful at having relatively higher wages in manufacturing, as we'll see in a few more slides. It hasn't really had adverse impacts on employment. So sometimes people are worried about, will this discourage investment or employment or job openings? Well, Germany has an even lower unemployment rate than the U.S. at about 3.1%. So you've got a lot of automation and capital deepening in Germany. It's a much more manufacturing-heavy economy. And so, if you've got things like higher profits from automation, then because of these labor market institutions, you're going to get higher profits being shared with workers to some extent, kind of standard effect. And also, you don't necessarily get wages falling. So, you've got wage scales that are set. And so then if there's automation, then those wages won't fall. You'll just reallocate workers into other jobs. So I think that this would fit really well, thinking about kind of collective bargaining in this Nash bargaining framework, this search and matching model. Just said that you have a kind of labor aggregate, and the firm essentially has to purchase a whole labor aggregate rather than bilaterally bargaining with an individual worker. So they're going to buy the kind of full set of labor that's appropriate for their technology. And then you negotiate the price ahead of time, so the wage is set for any kind of task distribution. And then, once the wage is set, then workers are going to encounter firms, and they're going to set a match. Without bilaterally bargaining, the wage will already be set, and then they'll just form an employment match if the wage is in between the reservation wage and the value of the worker. And so, you get a lot of distortions from these kind of tax and spend policies. Part of the reason for implementing these kind of co-determination institutions after World War II was to avoid the kind of big government or tax and spend policies, to keep kind of free market system, but just strengthening the bargaining power of workers so that then you don't need to have all these distorted policies. So I suspect that considering these kind of co-determination institutions would likely be a relatively favorable policy relative to the others like UBI. So, we've got a lot more automation in Germany. This is from the Douth et al. Paper. So if you look at robots per 1,000 workers, it's much higher in the black line in Germany. The US has a lot less per 1,000 workers, and that's because manufacturing is just a much larger share of the economy in Germany. So the US has largely, kind of deindustrialized, and so there's just a lot more robots per worker in Germany. And you see the same kind of effects from automation. So the medium skilled are seeing their jobs destroyed, and it's really in these kind of routine things like a machine operative, so a kind of standard factory worker. So you're seeing the same kind of effects that this paper finds, that you're destroying the kind of middle skilled jobs, but it's not going to have the same impacts in terms of the social consequences like in the US Rust Belt, where you're seeing high unemployment. So workers are simply moving into different tasks, and overall this paper finds no effect on employment. So essentially firms are no longer hiring new workers, they're just going to move automated workers into different tasks. And so Germany is kind of the leading manufacturing country because despite having less than a third of the population of the US, it exports about the same, and a larger share of its exports are in manufacturing. So, we might want to consider them really as the leading industrial power today rather than the US because they've kept a higher share of manufacturing. If you look at manufacturing wages, you might say, well, Germany's just doing wage repression. They're able to compete just because they've kept wages low. Well, you're much better off being a manufacturing worker in Germany, so your wages are much higher, about 33% higher. So this kind of profit-sharing mechanism is working. And if you look at inequality, it has gone up a bit in Germany. It's gone up a bit in the US. But overall, it still remains a very equitable country. So I would argue that this is a fairly successful model. That would be one kind of policy to consider relative to automation. So overall, I really like this paper. I appreciate the authors would write it, and then I could discuss it. I could be bold, if I can be bold and argue that automation is largely a solved problem, that we do have cases of policies that have worked to address automation. It's election season, so you can vote for co-determination if you want. There's some candidates that are looking at that. And hopefully we can provide some better policy frameworks to address the problems with automation going forward. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, Gabe. Okay, we're gonna have some time for some questions. I'll probably take 2 or 3 initially. Okay. And but first, I wanted to make a comment. When Gabe mentioned that it seems like we have this spark and worry about automation, I'm reminded. So one of my guilty pleasures at night before I go to bed is I watch The Twilight Zone, and I've counted 6 episodes over the last 3 seasons that focus specifically, 6 episodes over the last 3 seasons that focus specifically on what robots and automation is going to do to people and society and so on and so forth. So clearly they cared about this around the time my mother was born in the early 60s. Okay, Molly?
Hi there, I'm Molly Kinder. I'm a new David Rubenstein Fellow with the Metro Policy Program. I have 2 questions for Henry. One is, I'd love to unpack a little bit, and I know you had to go pretty fast because of the time, the empirical model where you derive the third, 2/3. My understanding is that I'm assuming your data on the routine work is primarily comprised of the clerical and secretarial work, as well as the more production work. And my understanding of looking over the last 30 years of automation experience is that the predominantly female labor force of clerical has had a very different experience than the more male-dominated production work when it comes to this question of labor force participation and whether or not those workers are falling down into low-skilled worker moving up. And the reason why I'm raising this is I'm wondering how you're factoring in your model. You talked about freezing the worker, but in fact, there's a more dynamic experience that was happening with women, which is over those years, they were gaining more human capital and education. So if you look at what happened to women over that time, many of those women moved into higher skilled, high-paying jobs because of the human capital formation. So I'd love to just unpack that a little bit and question some of the assumptions given some of those changes. How do we take that into account in your model? And my second point is I just wanted to bring a little bit of a human perspective and a job quality question to you had a slide up that talked about why aren't more people taking jobs such as these fast-growing personal care jobs. I just finished this large human-centered research project where I led a team where we interviewed workers in exactly some of these routine jobs and low-skilled jobs that are at the highest risk of automation. So secretaries, administrative assistants, legal assistants, and we asked questions about if you lost your job, what would you do? It's interestingly, many of those workers had previously worked in those female-dominated, care-based social work, child care, personal care aides. For them, moving from a routine administrative job into one of those jobs is a huge fall in the job quality. Those jobs are tiring. A lot of these women are older. They're physically exhausting, running around after kids, lifting people in beds. They're terrible pay. They're horrible hours. And I think this question of what motivates someone to go into some of these jobs, we have to talk about job quality. So I'm wondering in your model why something like raising the minimum wage or raising the quality of those jobs so that people who may be losing welfare moving into those jobs are not losing welfare so much.
Marcus, can I answer that? There's a lot there that
We'll come
So
back
I
to
don't
you.
wanna-
Okay. Well, if you want to answer it.
My short-term memory is not great, so I want to address your questions as soon as I can. So, first, with respect to the gender differences in the experience of routine work loss. So, what's interesting, and this gets back to one of the questions that was asked earlier on, is, the male and female experience is very different. So, if you look at the typical male routine worker, I think a good characterization would be a production worker on the factory floor. The technology to automate some of their tasks was introduced in the late 60s and the 1970s. That's when industrial, CPU-controlled robotics was introduced. But you don't see their employment losses happening concurrent with that time. It wasn't until the 1982, the back-to-back 1980, 1982 recessions when employment in those occupations were lost during the recession and then they never came back. If you think about secretarial work, bank tellers, that was really, automation of those tasks was really enabled by the introduction of the personal computer, which happened in, the mid to late 1970s. But of course, throughout the 1980s, employment in those occupations, and especially amongst women in those occupations, continued to rise through the 1980s. And employment losses in those occupations, the disappearance of those routine jobs, that didn't happen until the 1991 recession, then the 2001 recession, and really now after the financial crisis, Great Recession of 2009. So, as to the business cycle effect and kind of this delayed effect, you've seen it in the past, 30, 40 years. Automation doesn't come necessarily when the technology comes. It's usually delayed, and this automation happens in short, sharp bursts. The losses happen in recessions, and those occupations don't come back, okay? And in terms of, the fact that the female-male experience has been very different, you're exactly right. These routine jobs amongst men are typically occupations that involved little more than a high school education, whereas the routine jobs that women were working required some post-secondary education. And what women have done is they've actually moved up the educational ladder to a much greater extent than men have. They've moved up the occupational ladder. They've been able to get the better high-paying jobs. And in other work that, my colleague Nir and Matias Cortez and I have done is we've actually provided what we think is credible evidence that, it's not, technological change and automation doesn't just affect what occupations are getting worked and what occupations aren't anymore. It also changes the nature of work within occupations. And so we have evidence, I think, that shows that there's been an increasing demand for interpersonal and social skills within jobs. I think one of the reasons why bank tellers didn't disappear right away is because the nature of what they did changed. They didn't just, take your money, stamp a receipt and hand it to you, or just dole out money. Their work became much more consumer focused than in the past. And so the nature of work can change. The nature of tasks within occupations can change. We have found that it's changed towards more human-based tasks like interpersonal and social skills, and that's one of the factors that have allowed women to better withstand automation than men.
Thanks, Henry. I do want to direct you, if you want to learn more about this topic. In our first conference, we had a paper written by Patricia Cortez and Jessica Pine, where they talked about these issues at length and developed some new techniques to actually measure them. So you can check our automation page, the Future Middle Class Initiative page in the automation stream for a copy of that paper from the September 13th conference. Okay, we're going to take a few more questions, then I'll come back to Gabe and Henry.
Yeah, yes, Great School, Justina Capital. So thank you for the discussion. I find the framework very interesting. The question is for Henry. On the macro policy implications, you highlighted two areas of potentially high potence, training and taxing. So on taxing, have you thought about, we take tax on income as a accepted practice. Have you thought about taxing robots or taxing disruptors?
Okay.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Can you hear me?
Oh, well first, Lawrence, and then you two.
Okay. I'm loud. I'm Larry Michel from the Economic Policy Institute. Appreciate the paper. I want to question whether it's useful to focus on job polarization as anything useful for insights, because I think the main phenomena that needs to be explained is wage inequality and wage stagnation. And we know that changes of occupational composition has had very little to do with anything about wage stagnation or wage inequality. Most of wage inequality is within occupations. And if you want to connect it to the personal skills or something like that, I'm waiting for evidence on that, but I have not seen that. And I think the comment by Molly is exactly right on. The idea of shifting people to routine manual work when it's been, even though it's been expanding, but it's very low wage and exploited and without benefits is kind of surprising. One comment on labor share, similar to what Gabriel said, he's presented data on household income inequality, but if you look at actual distribution of wages, the only real significant phenomena within the wages is the near doubling of the share of the top 1%. So I'm not sure, whether this automation is really a salient thing. And last, I find the discussion in this paper policy and in the earlier discussion somewhat otherworldly in the sense that if you went back 30 to 35 years to people in this room talking about manufacturing experience and the implosion of manufacturing, you would find they would have said, let's have more productivity, let's have more innovation, and let's educate people. And if you look what happened, manufacturing workers, there was no evidence that any education or training really helped them all that much. There was not enough given, but what happened was they got shifted to lousier jobs. And so what that brings forward is we're missing the deterioration of the quality of jobs and the deterioration of wages and benefits for most people, and it's surprising to find a discussion now that ignores the crisis of the last 40 years in thinking about the crisis that may be coming.
Okay, let's take two more down here, and then Gabe and Henry can respond.
Martha Ross, a fellow at Brookings Metro. So in response to your open question, we currently, I would say, have no capacity, or very, very limited capacity to do the kind of large-scale training that you propose, which is not to say that we don't know how to do it. There are good models, there is knowledge, it is underfunded. We don't have the political will to make the hard choices to allocate funding to where it needs to go or to overcome institutional inertia to get places to do it better, or to focus on it. And we don't have the kind of employer involvement that we need. Secondly, I wonder if there's a way to pair what was described earlier as companies with better management practices doing better, to pair some kind of business services assistance to help more companies have more efficient, more productive internal processes, along with a focus on helping them derive greater productivity from their workers, which would probably involve some skill development. And lastly, this is a sort of a plea to policy wonks and economists at large. I really think we should stop conflating low skill with low wage, because it is disrespectful. If you look at the work that, just to highlight the care occupations are doing, that is skilled work. It's just skills that are not valued in the labor market.
One more.
Thank you, Dave Rubinowitz. You seem to be, the goal of your policy seems to be increasing labor force participation rather than increasing quality of life of people. And I'm wondering if that's a good idea, because the points just made are basically getting people into these bad jobs is not increasing the quality of their life at all. And as for personal care, in Japan and China right now, they're already employing robots for personal care. It's being tested now in some residence homes in the US, and it's coming very soon. Robots have the advantage of not forgetting, not getting sick, and actually enjoying hearing the same story over and over again. Should we be worrying about labor force participation or quality of life? And this is where the rest of Keynes's paper is very relevant, the part that hadn't been quoted yet today.
Okay, so first, taxing robots. Is it useful to focus on job polarization, issues related to management at firms, and quality of life or labor force participation?
Yeah. Okay. So those are great questions. So yes, in terms of taxing robots, that is something that we do consider in the paper. And yes, you can tax robots. Essentially, what advances in automation technology does is it makes it cheaper to buy this automation capital. You tax the purchase of that capital. You could just undo the improvements in technology, and you can just wipe that all away. So in our model, it's a very easy thing to do. The question is whether you want to do it, whether you want to stifle that, whether you want to stifle the economic pie from growing, or do you allow the pie to grow and then just redistribute better? The question about whether we should be talking about automation or wage inequality, and unfortunately this is a conference on automation, so I have to talk about automation. But I do agree. The wider question about wage inequalities is relevant. I do think that within the context of our model, which is obviously a very wonkish model, we do have an ability to think about labor market institutions and how the economic pie is split up over and above redistributive policies. Like I said, there's built into the model a wage bargaining process, which depends on the relative bargaining strength of firms and workers. Gabriel pointed out, rather than having bilateral bargaining, you could think about centralized bargaining as done in the German works councils. But at least within the context of bilateral bargaining, we could think about evolution or changes in the bargaining power of workers versus firms. It's interesting to think that, I think there's an understanding that, at least in the U.S. context, these personal care, basic health care occupations are low-paying jobs in the U.S. That's not necessarily the case in Canada, where I'm from. They're still relatively low-paying, but they're not, in absolute terms, the same level of lowness. And I think one of the things that informs that is that our labor market institutions in Canada are different. The union, just as a simple thing to observe, unionization rates in Canada, even though our industrial composition is very similar across the U.S. and Canada, unionization rates are 2 to 3 times that of the U.S., and that is an example of a labor market institution.
I'm sorry to interrupt. But does that mean you could use your model to increase worker bargaining power and see what effect that had?
Yes, that is a parameter in
done
the
that?
model. We have not done that, no.
That would be great to see.
Okay. Yeah, and then in terms of, as Gabriel was talking about, yes, the German works councils, again, because Germany's, those works councils exist largely in manufacturing, that's tied into the apprenticeship system. But my understanding is that in Germany, the works council, which represents these machine operators, they are much more involved with the adoption and implementation of automation technology. And that means that like I was saying before, the machine operator occupation has evolved much more in Germany than it has in the US. A machine operator in the US is just someone who pushes a button. Whereas in Germany, they are training the machine operator also to calibrate the machine and to optimize workflow. So that's another example of evolution of tasks within occupations that, again, differs across labor market institutions as represented by works councils. The US-Canada comparison is perhaps measured by differences in unionization rates. But yeah, these are things that are worthy of discussion, absolutely.
Gabe, you got anything to add to that?
No, I think that was good. I mean, the apprenticeship system is something I didn't have time for. Oh, thank you. But, it's part of the story. So it's not just a co-determination story. I think there are a lot of lessons, though, from Germany that, we could think about here. Related to Larry's point, that was kind of the points I was trying to get across in my discussion.
Gabe, speaking to the mic.
Okay. I was trying to get into in my discussion was that, it is really conditional on these labor market institutions. So in terms of the modeling, thinking about that deeper, I think is useful.
Okay, one last question. Anybody have anything? Okay, so I want to thank Henry for his interesting paper and Gabe for his fantastic discussion. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be back.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.